In this time period, we want to take a special look at some of the developments of England between 1603 and 1648, in part because so much of Western development, especially this part of the world as a former colony of England, many of these decisions and ideas in Western civilization history also have a tendency to bleed over into early American history. And so it's worth a little bit of time here to take a look at some things. This is a stamp showing a portrait of King James I, all right? Go back for a second. Remember when we talked about the time period of Elizabeth I in England, when she was queen after 1558, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was going to be the heir, right? Because Elizabeth never married. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a child. His name is James, but James was taken from her and raised as a Presbyterian Calvinist in Scotland while his mother ran away, was in prison, and eventually died, and of course that set off the Spanish Armada. But here's the idea. James is raised in Scotland with the idea that as king, he is directly connected to God, that he is not merely the king because he's the older surviving son of the previous monarch, that he is somehow divinely chosen. And there's a couple of ways for us to remember this. Remember, for some people who come out of the Christian tradition, up until this century, there was a version of the English Bible called the King James Version. He is the King James who ordered a new Bible to be written, in the sense that he wanted people to access the Word of God. He also had this idea that if they could access the Word of God, they would be better able to understand that he was a representative of God on earth and therefore obey him more through the bishops and through the other parts of the church. Now, James has some other ideas that go in conflict with English tradition, and as a Scotsman coming down from England to become the new king in 1603, he faces great discrimination. He is seen as an outsider, as a foreigner, and they are very unhappy with him, and his religious ideas seem to be kind of crazy to many of the English who have just gone through the time period of Elizabeth I, where she gave lots of leeway and lots of ability for people to believe what they wished. James is going to come in and create some problems because he will be sort of infringing, at least the English see this, infringing on some of their religious liberties, and he also flirts with some of the ideas that they don't particularly like, in the sense, for example, that his oldest son, who will become the next king, is married to a French Roman Catholic princess. That sets off a lot of difficulties for people in England. So James comes down and is going to create a situation for many. He will increasingly go to bat and argue with Parliament about lots of different ideas. He has this idea of divine right theory, but also it is the time period under him where these issues are popping up. Puritans are people who believe that the church in England has become corrupt or hasn't gone far enough to take out Catholic practices or hasn't done enough to bring in more Calvinism or more clear ideas from the scriptures. They want to purify. They are puritanical in their beliefs. Many of them are very much opposed to the way the church is operating, very much opposed to James. They will eventually leave and try to form their own religious colony in what you know as the Netherlands. It will not be successful, but from there they will head off to a place on a ship named the Mayflower. They'll head off to a place called Massachusetts, and that will set forth a colonial experience, a religious colonial experience in the New World that many of us are familiar with, but essentially this is a link back to the Western civilization. These people leave England because they don't like the religious settlement of James I, and later on his son Charles I either, and they are going to set up their own sort of a heaven on earth in Massachusetts. There's a joke in there somewhere, but I'll leave Massachusetts to be considered heaven for others. The son, Charles I, who had married a Roman Catholic princess from France. Many people in England suspect him as being sort of a crypto-Catholic, of wanting to take England back to the bad old days of Roman Catholicism. He is going to want to clear out the problems. And in 1629, he stops calling Parliament together for taxation purposes. He essentially tries to rule all by himself for 11 years, which really much goes against what the elite who have been building up Parliament for years and generations. They always saw themselves as partners of the monarch. Now they're being actively excluded, and the king is trying to set up his own kind of absolutist government, collecting taxes that the people say are illegal. He says they are not. For 11 years, the king refuses to call Parliament and offers nothing in response. There's a huge sense of dread. Lots of people in the elite classes think that Charles is leading them off a cliff into a bad political place. He finally calls Parliament together in 1640, and immediately it sets off a firestorm of debate and contributions of lots of people saying we should do this, we should do that. There is great controversy. Charles is labeled in many ways a very absolutist and powerful man. He appears to have a bit of a thin skin, and what happens is a civil war is going to break out. And the Civil War is in part about religion. It's also in part about the boundaries of religious and political authority by the king. It's kind of a mess because it mixes politics and religion, but this English Civil War is going to start in 1642, and as we go into the Civil War, increasingly the power of Oliver Cromwell, a landowner, a descendant of one of the servants of Henry VIII, he is, by his own admission, a very independent religious thinker. He, in many ways, is able to convince people that he has sort of righteousness on his side, that he's an instrument of divine will. He and other people are going to create what's called the New Model Army, which will be an army in the Civil War, but it also has a lot of very powerful religious thinkers in it, and they have lots and lots of viewpoints. Some of those people are Presbyterian, some are traditional Anglican, high church Anglicans of the Henry VIII stamp. Some of them are dissenters of various kinds, levelers and diggers, and there's a bunch of other labels that are used for them. But there's great religious diversity within the Protestant movement in England, and there's no unanimous understanding of what should be done. Eventually, Charles is taken captive. He is put on trial as being basically a criminal. And he is put on trial not as king, but as just Charles Stuart, using his family's last name. And he will be executed in the early part of 1649, right at the end of the period we're covering. But essentially, the British government now is run by somebody who's not a king. There is no House of Lords, and there is no state church. England is going to provide a very provocative example of the nature by which religious divisions and intoleration will lead to great diversity. This is also going to link to American history because many religious minorities back in Great Britain, Roman Catholics, people later on who are going to be under the control of William Penn and sent off to Pennsylvania. Many Roman Catholics are going to end up in Maryland. Americans' early history is also linked to this era of great religious diversity, and the American colonies are seen as a place to send the most unhappy and recalcitrant religious groups, have them go to the New World and start over and leave us alone behind. Take a look in your textbook at this very simple development of England in this time period. Notice the trend towards absolutism that is feared by many in the English public, and then see that they do chop off the head of the king and put a sort of an end to that absolutist trend. See also if there's some questions in your sample test bank to walk you through some of the key information here.